Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah. This is now episode 72 of the podcast The Forward, myself, Brother Mahdi Locke, and today we are continuing with the series on a summary of the rulings of Waqf. So today is part 2, and we are covering pages 485 to 488 from the book al-Yaqut, an-Nafees by Imam Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Umar al-Shatiri. And today we are looking at, in particular, the conditions of the beneficiary of the endowment, i.e. the al-Mawquf alayh, and the conditions of the dedicated article, which is the Mawquf. So, without any further ado, well, actually, there's one thing to mention. This text of what I'm reading today is already published on my blog, and it's linked below the video. So if you want to follow along with the text, you are more than welcome to do so. So the Imam continues with his metin, and he says, the conditions of the beneficiary of the endowment are two. The first is that it not be disobedience, and the second is that it would be possible to take possession of it if it is a specific item. So what does this mean? So the first thing, that it not be disobedience, right? You're not giving this, you're not setting up a waqf for the benefit of disobedience or something disobedient. In the footnote, he says, whether it is general or specific, for it is not valid for the proceeds of the endowment to go towards building, the building of a church that will be used for worship, nor the servant of a church that is used for worship. It is valid for the beneficiaries to be poor as well as rich, i.e. those who are denied zakat, even if it doesn't appear to be an act of drawing near to Allah to give to them. Sorry. So an interesting point he's making here is that yes, there are the 8 zakat categories that Allah has mentioned in Surah At-Tawbah, the 9th chapter, verse 60. But that doesn't mean that waqf is restricted to those categories as well. Waqf can be granted to the benefit of people who are not, or made for the benefit of people who are not necessarily masakin or fuqara. They don't fit the category of faqir and miskin. Now, to go into more detail about this, of a faqir and miskin in Shafi'i fiqh, a faqir has less than half of what he needs to meet his expenses. So for example, if a faqir is someone, would be someone, let's say they have £1,000 a month of expenses, but their income is only £250, £300. Right? That's a faqir. That's poor. Whereas a miskin, this term usually translated as someone who's short of money. A miskin is someone who, again, would have, say, £1,000 of expenses per month, but they're only making 750 or something, or 800, meaning they have more than half of their needs met. They're making more than £500. They have more than half their needs met, but they're not quite there, so they're short of money. So what the Imam is mentioning in this footnote, he's saying that that someone does not have to be of these categories in order to be a recipient of waqf. It's not the same thing. So he says, even though it looks like it's not an act of drawing near to Allah, it is in fact an act of drawing near to Allah. The second footnote about being able to take possession of it, what's called in Arabic imkan tamalluki, i.e. for the dedicated article from the endower at the time the endowment is made. Okay, so the dedicated article is something that the endower can actually hand over at the time the endowment is made. Thus, it is not valid to dedicate a Muslim slave or a mushaf for the benefit of a disbeliever, because these are things that a disbeliever is not allowed to have and should not be in the possession of a disbeliever. And it is also not valid for the beneficiary to be an unborn child, due to the invalidity of it taking possession, whether it is specifically intended or included in a group, such that if there are children and one unborn child, it is not included. Yes, after it is born, it is included, but that is unless the endower has named those present or mentioned their number, in which case it is not included. The beneficiary also cannot be someone deceased, nor can the dedicated article be a slave for the beneficiary of that slave, or for the benefit of oneself. And the same goes for an owned beast, unless its owner is intended. So, for example, if someone makes an endowment for the benefit of one's children and they leave it open-ended, they just say this endowment is for the benefit of my children, or for the children of so-and-so, then it's fine. If there are children who are not yet born yet, when they are born, they then come under that category of this person's children, and that's fine. Whereas if someone says this this endowment is for the benefit of sorry, if this endowment is for the benefit of my 2 children, or my 3 daughters, or my 5 sons and daughters, and then they mention the names, like this endowment is for the benefit of Zayd, Ahmed, Fatima, Aisha, and Mahmoud, then obviously any child born after that is going to be excluded from this, because they have not been specifically mentioned. Whereas a more general statement like my children or the children of such and such would include everyone. And it also says the beneficiary cannot be someone who's deceased, nor can a dedicated article be a slave for the beneficiary of that slave. That doesn't work. Or for the benefit of oneself. And the same goes for an own beast unless its owner is intended. And this issue of an endowment for the benefit of oneself, this is going to be discussed later on in the chapter. Okay, so back to the main text. So he says at the end of the last paragraph I read, he says, oh sorry, not the last paragraph, back to the main text, he says here, the conditions for the beneficiary of the endowment are 2. And so now we're looking at the commentary. That it not be in disobedience, such that if one were to dedicate a place to be used as a tavern, i.e. a pub, a bar, this covers the same meaning, or the like, it would not be valid because it would be assisting in depravity and disobedience. An endowment can only be in obedience or that which is permissible. What we mean by obedience here is the broader meaning here is something that is rewardable, as opposed to just being merely permissible. It's actually rewardable as well. So it would come to the category of being mustahab as opposed to just merely mubah. The Imam then brings up a question. He says, is it allowed to dedicate land to be used for ball games, e.g. football, soccer, baseball, whatever? They have said, if it will not result in mingling between the sexes and having games there will not include obligatory prayers being left off, such that it does not cause those who are weak in faith to miss one of the obligatory prayers, especially the sunset prayer. This is Salat al-Maghrib. And again, Salat al-Maghrib is an important one to mention because its time is short. Its time is usually an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and a half. So if someone is enthralled in playing a game of baseball or something like this, and Salat al-Maghrib comes in, then there's a high likelihood that person will miss the prayer. He finishes this chapter off, this paragraph off, and he says, if it is free of disobedience, then it is allowed to dedicate it, because it is permissible. And then he goes on to say that they have said, when he says they have said, he means the ulama of the past. He says, it is allowed to dedicate pins in order for clothes to be hung on them. And then he has a section here called From the Guidance of the Experts. And he says, on the topic of pins, they mentioned that a man came to Sheikh Ahmed Barakat and asked for some charity. So he gave him a harf. So a harf here is a currency that was equivalent to a quarter or a half of a Saudi riyal at that time. So I think, what is it? A riyal is about a quarter of a US dollar. Yeah, so we're looking at maybe something equivalent of 10 cents, 12 cents, something like that. US, UK, what, 15 pence, something like this. So he gave him a harf. The man thought it was a rather small amount. So Barakat, Sheikh Barakat, looked at the man and said, maybe you think this harf is a small amount, while it could enable you to buy something that you will benefit from for a week, or something you will benefit from for a month, or something you will benefit from for a year, or something you will benefit from your entire life. The man was astonished and said, how can that be? So he responded, if you want to buy something that you will benefit from for a week, then buy some salt. If you want something for a month, buy a box of matches. If you want something for a year, buy 4 handheld fans. If you want something for a lifetime, buy 4 pins, nail them to the wall of your house, and hang your clothes off them for the rest of your life. And then your inheritors can use them after you. Right? So this is a beautiful example of how you can use something so simple and small, right? Something that costs a few cents or a few pence, and it can be a sadaqah jariyah for you for forever. Just put some pins on the wall, hang your clothes on them. Let the people come after you, your sons and daughters and grandchildren, let them use them after you. And the reward is going back to you. Something very, very small, but it could have a massive effect on your reward in the hereafter. Then he says, they also mentioned that Al-Sayyid Abdul Mawla ibn Tahir, who was an intelligent man, was visited by some guests, and that day he welcomed them, fed them, and sat with them until after Asr, right? So it's the mid-afternoon prayer. And he was being courteous with them while believing that they would leave, but none of them moved. So he went out and came back with some fans and sent to them, because remember in the previous story he mentioned handheld fans. So he came back with some fans and said to them, everyone, these are some fans from Ba Yurawih, right? Which actually means he provides rest, right? And he repeated it until they understood that he wanted them to leave his house and let him rest. They knew what was being implied, and thus they left. Right? That's just an interesting story, a tidbit that the Shaykh has included. The second condition, from the conditions of the beneficiary, of the endowment, is that it be possible for him to take possession of it if it is something specified, and thus the beneficiary cannot be someone deceased or an unborn child, as mentioned in the main text above and the footnote. Okay, so that's the first half of today's lesson done. So the second half is the conditions of the dedicated article, right? So the conditions of the actual mawquf, the thing that's going to be made into an endowment. So he says in the metin, in the main text, the conditions of the dedicated article are 8. That it be a particular article, that it be specified, that it be owned. There's a footnote here about owned. It says, yes, it is valid for the ruler to dedicate lands belonging to the Muslim treasury for a specific purpose on the condition that the benefit therein be manifest, as his spending it is dependent on that, such as the guardian of an orphan. So in the same way that the guardian of an orphan cannot use the orphan's wealth in a way that will not benefit the orphan, it has to be in a way that will benefit the orphan. It can't be in a way that will be detrimental to the orphan. The same thing applies here to the ruler who wants to use lands belonging to the Muslim treasury. The benefit therein has to be manifest. Okay, and then the other footnotes that he mentions here, he says that the article has to be permissible. So in the footnote he says it would not be permissible, for example, to dedicate a musical instrument. And also under the point that it must be used for its intended purpose, he gives a footnote and he says, if one were to dedicate a dirham, i.e. a silver coin, which is money, if one were to dedicate a dirham to be used for embellishment, i.e. jewelry, it would not be valid because embellishment is not its intended purpose. Likewise, it is not valid to dedicate dirhams that will be used to trade with and then donate the profit to the poor. And the same goes for making a bequest out of them for the same purpose. Okay, so when you make an endowment of something, it has to be for the purpose that was initially intended by it. And we will see more about this in the commentary. So, in the commentary, the Imam begins and he says, the conditions of the dedicated article are 8. The first is that it be a particular article, as it is not valid to dedicate the mere right to use something. So the right to use something, and this is something that comes up a lot in discussion on waqf, is the menfa'ah, right? Which you can compare in English would be the term like usufruct, which means that one would dedicate a house or apartment. If you're making a waqf, you would dedicate the house or the apartment as opposed to merely the right to reside therein. So this is what we mean by, or this is how we should explain or understand the difference between a menfa'ah and an ayn, right? Sahab al-ayn wa sahab al-menfa'ah. Who owns the actual article and who's using it. So if you own a house and you rent that house out to someone, and that person is now paying a monthly amount for their rent, you are the sahab al-ayn. You own the actual house itself. So it's your right to buy, it's your right to sell it. Well, you can't say buy it, but it's your right to sell it. It's your right to give it away to someone. It's your right to put it in your will so that your heirs can have it. Your heirs can have it when you pass away. Whereas the person who's renting the house is the sahab al-manfa'ah. He's the one. He owns the beneficial use of it, or the usufruct of that thing. So because we have this division, what that means is you as the Sahib al-Ain, you can't go into the house and start sleeping there and say, well, it's my house, I own it. No, you don't, because you've made a contract. The other person owns the right to live in the house. He owns the right to use the house, right? You can't go in and just invade and sleep there and squat there. You can't do that. In the same way that the guy who's renting the house from you, he's Sahib al-Manfa'a and not Sahib al-Ain, right? He owns the use of the house, but not the actual house itself. He can't sell it. He can't rent it out to someone else. He can't put it in his will or give it away to anyone. Okay, so this is a clear difference. There's the Sahib al-Ain and Sahib al-Manfa'a. So when you're making a waqf, you have to give the ayn. You have to actually give the particular article as an endowment, not merely the use of something. And when you think about this, potential wisdoms here is that the ayn is something that will have permanence. The actual article itself is permanence. The use of something does not have permanence. It can come to an end. The contract can end, and then it can go to someone else, and so on and so forth. And I believe this is discussed in greater detail in the actual book itself by al-Khatib al-Sharbini. And Allah knows best. So, this is the first condition. That it has to be a particular article and is not valid to merely dedicate or to dedicate the mere right to use something. Question comes up, is it permissible to dedicate shares that one has in companies? The answer is, if they change and are exchanged, then it is not valid to dedicate them. If they are firmly established as particular articles, then it is valid to dedicate them. As for monetary shares in commercial companies, it is not valid to dedicate them according to the school of Imam Shafi'i, because the condition of dedicated article is that it be a particular established article. However, some schools do hold that it is permissible to dedicate the right to use something. So if you are not a Shafi'i and listening to this, please leave a comment below. If you know the answer to these questions, if you from the Maliki school or the Hanbali school, and you have the ruling on this issue, please do share it with us. The second condition is that it be specified. For if one were to say, I dedicate one of these two houses, it would not be valid until one has specified it. One says, no, it's this house, not one of two houses. However, if one were to say, I dedicate one of my slaves, the endowment is valid and specification is obligatory. Okay, now just a question here, because I know this term comes up a lot about slavery and was mentioned in the previous podcast. And I know this word does trouble people, and rightfully so, especially if you're coming from the United States. I do have a podcast on my blog titled New World Slavery versus Slavery in Islam, which I recorded over a year ago with Al-Hajj Abu Jafar Al-Hanbali. I might put a link to it below, and I'll also link it to the end of this video, inshallah, so you can watch that to get further details about what we mean by this. So just what I want the listener to understand here is that when we're talking about Islam, when we're looking at fiqh, and the word slave comes up, the word slavery comes up, it is not the same thing that should be understood in the American context. We're not talking about the Atlantic slave trade. We're talking about something completely different. So please listen to that podcast if you have the chance, so that these issues can be understood and elucidated for you, inshallah. Now, so I'll just repeat, the second condition is that it be specified. For if one were to say, I dedicate one of these two houses, it would not be valid until one has specified. However, if one were to say, I dedicate one of my two slaves, the endowment is valid and specification is obligatory. So there's a slight difference in the technicalities here, but the endowment regarding the slaves is still valid. It's just that afterwards the specification has to be made. Whereas the endowment regarding the houses, where someone says, I dedicate one of my two houses, is not valid to begin with. That's the difference. Now, the next point the Imam brings up, as he says, is regarding attaching stipulations to an endowment. And he says, it is permissible to stipulate that an endowment be made after one's death. So if one were to say, in quotes, I have dedicated such and such after my death for the benefit of the poor, it would be permissible, and the endowment would fall under the ruling of bequests. If the endowment was implemented and one stipulated that the proceeds be given to the beneficiaries after one's death, that would also be permissible. So there's two ways of doing it. The third condition is that it be owned, as it is not permissible to have an endowment that has been dedicated on top of another endowment. This has happened and it is problematic. There are masjids that have land next to them that has been endowed for agriculture, and then they expand the masjid and incorporate the land. Right? So you got two endowments in one. You have an endowment of land for agriculture, and then you have a masjid that's an endowment. And the masjid expands and takes over the land that's supposed to be for agriculture. Or, that's another example he gives, there's a bathhouse that hasn't been endowed, and they abolish it and incorporate it into the masjid. An endowment on top of an endowment is not valid. But when they have been compelled to do so, they have followed other schools, i.e. other madhahib, aside from the Shafi'is, that deem it permissible. And Imam al-Allama as-Sayyid Abdullah al-Aydrus incorporated the bathhouse of Masjid al-Saqaf into the main masjid at the beginning of the 14th century AH. Right? So there's a difference of opinion between the madhabs, between the Shafi'is and others. The fourth condition is that it be transferable. And this excludes the slave girl who gives birth to her master's son, what's called walad, as is not permissible to dedicate her because it is not permissible for her master to transfer her in any way that would eliminate ownership. Thus, she is not transferable because she will be freed after his death. And again, like I mentioned before, for these issues about slavery in Islam, please listen to the podcast, Slavery in Islam versus New World Slavery. I forget which order I put the title in, but that's the comparison. Slavery in Islam compared to New World Slavery, the North Atlantic slave trade, and slavery in America in particular. Please listen to that to get the full picture, insha'Allah. The fifth condition is that it be beneficial. Even if only in the future, such as dedicating a young donkey to a masjid. As for terminally ill donkey, it is not permissible to dedicate it because it has no benefit, and the same goes for someone who wants to dedicate his runaway slave. As for dedicating a trained dog, there are two positions in our school. The relied upon position is that is not allowed, but there is a second position that permits such dedication, and it is a strong position. Right, because again, for the Shafi'is, because the Shafi'is regard dogs on the whole as najis, it's not permissible to actually own them. So if someone quote unquote has a dog, it's actually referred to as ikhtisas, as in this dog is specifically attributable to this person, so to speak, right? But it's not officially or formally regarded as ownership. But again, there's a difference of opinion between the madhabs. Depending on the madhab you follow, please look into the matter. Now, the Imam puts in just a historical note here. He says, the first person to place basins in the masjids of Hadramaut, he says, as long as the lesson is on endowments, we would love to mention an important historical point, which is the first person to establish masjids, the first person to establish basins in the masjids of Hadramaut was Imam al-Sayyid Abdurrahman al-Saqaf, and the earliest basins that still exist today, or the earliest basin that still exists today, is an ancient basin that stands alone just left of the entrance to his masjid, and it was built in the 8th century AH. Right, so we're looking at 600 or 700 years ago. The Imam continues with the commentary. The sixth is that its benefit does not necessitate the elimination of the article itself. Right, i.e., using the thing is not going to lead to the thing actually being eliminated. So, as for that which eliminates the article itself, such as a candle or a bag of rice, anything which its benefit cannot be obtained without it being eliminated is not valid to dedicate, because what is sought from endowments is permanence. Right? We want something to last as long as possible. Right? And that's why in the footnote he says, because an endowment, as they've said, is to retain the foundation and dedicate the proceeds to charitable purposes. The seventh article is that it be, or the seventh condition is that it be permissible, as it is not valid to dedicate musical instruments and that which is unlawful. Right, so you couldn't dedicate something usurious. You cannot dedicate anything to do with alcohol or pork or these kind of things. Right, it has to be permissible. And then the eighth condition is that it be used for its intended purpose. As it is not allowed to dedicate money to be used as an embellishment, right? So you can't, you have money, like you have dinars or dirhams, for example. You can't donate them or dedicate them to be used as jewelry or to decorate your wall or something like this. Because such a utility is not the intended purpose of money, right? Money is for trading. It's not for embellishment. And Allah knows best. So that concludes, well, alhamdulillah, that concludes part 2 of a summary of the rulings of Waqf. And alhamdulillah, we're within the time limit. So inshallah, within the next couple of weeks or so, I will do a part 3, and I think I'll do a part 4. I think that's the best way to do it. And then this nice summary will be completed and available for listeners. And inshallah, I will as well post the accompanying text on my blog so that readers can follow from there, because there are a lot of notes, a lot of footnotes. And I don't want people to be entirely reliable on just what I'm saying. I want people to have reference to actual text. And with Allah alone is every success. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.